Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Terrier Talk with your host, Alexander Allison. Now, with this being the first episode of Terrier Talk, an explanation of how this video series works is necessary. So, here's how this will work. Every week, I will discuss everything sports related at Vandebilt Catholic High School. I will discuss the effects of the results of the previous week, as well as preview the games and events that will come up in the next week. Every episode of this series will be broken up into segments. The result review, where, of course, I will be discussing the results of the previous week's games and what that means for each team. The guest interview, in which I will have a guest for the week, and we will discuss whatever major news is happening for the week in regards to that team or area of expertise for that person. Every other segment will be in chronological order, but this will come up whenever the specific subject matter comes up. The preview, which is simply enough previewing all the sporting events for the week, and finally, the main event. In the main event, I will discuss and go slightly more in-depth into whatever the biggest thing sports-related at Vandebilt is happening the next week. This will always come last and serve as the grand finale of each episode. Now, while this will be the structure for a normal episode, this episode is not a normal episode. I have almost 2 months of backlog for the winter sports, and if I wanted to get to that, it would take much longer than I would want to for this initial episode. So, instead, I will just discuss how each team is doing as a part of the preview for this week. Also, because school was off for winter break before this episode, I did not have a good chance to get an interview for this week. This means that the rest of the episode will just be a preview of the next week, but don't worry, we'll be back to the normal structure of things next week. Now, before we go on to the specific content of the sports and the previews for this week, I would like to make clear that I am much more in-depth and much more detailed in my information, as of right now at the very least, when it comes to basketball than when it comes to soccer. In the winter sports, basketball and soccer probably should get about the same amount of attention. However, because I do know much more about basketball than soccer right now, it's probably going to be a bit more detailed when it comes to basketball than when it comes to soccer, just as an example. This will be true no matter what season we're in. But as of right now, basketball and soccer is the big example, because basketball and soccer should be getting the same details, same specific information, but that might not be the case as of now. Now, in future weeks, when I have more potential sources and more potential information to get to, that might not be as big of a problem. But as for this show, it was a problem, and I'll talk about that when we get to soccer. I would also like to quickly bring up the sources that I will be using for this video. In future weeks, again, we'll have more secondhand sources, more sources of people, but right now I'm just using the two online sources that made this a lot more possible and a lot easier to do. The Vandebilt Catholic websites, specifically their calendar, as well as Max Preps. Max Preps gives nice previews of the games. It gives me a lot of information in order to use on this video. We also have a few minor sports to get to before talking about the major sports of course, varsity basketball and varsity soccer. Tennis and softball are both beginning their tryouts this week. Tennis on Monday, softball on Tuesday. We will talk about this a lot more when bringing up the season previews for those sports in a few weeks, but as of now, they're just in the tryout stage. We also have a lot of junior high games this week. The girls basketball team will be traveling to Thibodaux on Saturday. The girls soccer team will be hosting Houma Junior High on Thursday. And the boys basketball team will be traveling to ED White on Thursday as a rubber match. Now that game is very important. There's a lot of story behind it. The two teams had a pair of amazing games earlier on in the season, and like I said, this is the rubber match. As it is the rubber match with two very good teams in the same district, it of course has a lot of district implications. Now moving on to the big sports for this week, we'll start with boys basketball. Boys basketball begins the week on Wednesday, hosting South Plaquemine. This is a very interesting game for a few reasons. Firstly, South Plaquemine, over the last 2 years, I want to say is the only team we have a winning record against that we have played 4 times. We have a 3-1 record against them at this point over the last 2 years, including a very important win the first of the season a couple of years ago. However, this team seems to be much better this year than they were in years past. Last year, for example, they finished the season with a record of 13-19. This season, they already have 13 wins. We're only a little bit over halfway through the season at this point. They are currently 13-8. Now, despite that, this game is still very winnable for us. Of course, this is South Plaquemine. We do have a winning record against them, but outside of just the history of it, this is a Vandebilt team that can compete and has competed with almost every single team they've played. Even in the losses, most of them have been close or just a few mistakes away from being close. They've been very winnable games. They've been games that this team has been in. So this game is very winnable. This team can do it. It's just, will they? That's the question. And this is a very similar question in regards to the Letcher game. Statistically speaking, Letcher should make this game out of reach. Letcher has an over 30% higher win percentage than us at this point in the season, and Letcher also averages over 20 points per game more. However, on Thursday, in the Central Catholic Tournament over the Christmas break last week, Vandebilt was up 3 in the closing stages of the game. We end up giving up that lead. They send the game to overtime, and we end up losing the game in overtime by 6. However, that means that this game is very winnable. Not only winnable, it's a revenge game. We lost the first game. There's a lot at stake here. There's a lot of revenge on the mind of our Terriers this week in this game. So this game is huge. It's very important for that, and it's very winnable. Moving on to girls basketball. Girls basketball has 2 games this week, starting by hosting Central Catholic. Now, Central Catholic, we have a better record than, a better record against common opponents. We're ranked higher, and are specifically looking at those games against those common opponents. Our only loss against common opponents is against Terrebonne, and that was in a 25-30 loss and the Jack Becker Classic. We had a chance to win the game in the final seconds as well. Not a bad loss at all. Compare that to Central Catholic's loss to Terrebonne, 50-19. Very different. Almost embarrassing, even. And just looking at all those numbers, it's very clear to me that Vandebilt is clearly favored in this matchup. A little bit of a different, interesting story against St. James. A lot of those statistics are very similar. We have a better record, 500 to their 6-11. We have a better record against common opponents, 500 to their 3-4. And in a very similar situation to them with HL Bourgeois, as opposed to Terrebonne and Central Catholic. HL Bourgeois, we lost 245-43, while they lost, again, pretty embarrassingly, 69-38 to HL Bourgeois. However, despite all of this, St. James is ranked higher. But despite what the odds makers may tell you, I do like Vandebilt in this matchup. I do like Vandebilt in this game. I would favor us to win this game. Moving on, boys and girls soccer I will have together because they share the main event of this week, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Boys soccer, Tuesday, they host Letcher. They have a previous victory, head-to-head 2-0, as well as having a common record, both teams being undefeated against St. Charles Catholic. Vanderbilt's only played them once. Letcher has played them twice, but both undefeated, both beat St. Charles Catholic, somewhat handily. And looking at all that, looking at those numbers, I like our chances. Again, we're higher ranked. Won the head-to-head. I would not be surprised if history repeated itself with the previous victory earlier on in the season. We also may or may not have a game against Holy Cross. It's not on Max Preps, but it is on Vandebilt Catholic. I will still report it. I will still talk about it. Again, if the game happens, I assume the game happens. I like our chances in that as well. And moving on to girls soccer also has a Tuesday game against Lusher. It, again, on the Vandebilt Catholic website, not on Max Preps. I'm not sure why. It looks like the coach for girls soccer only puts the games on Max Preps after they have happened, as opposed to scheduling them beforehand. So it's a little bit harder for me to preview the games, but I will still do my due diligence. We have a much better record than Letcher. We are ranked much higher than Letcher. I have a feeling we'll get it done. Now we will move on to the main event. And of course, that is the boys and girls soccer teams traveling to ED White on Thursday night and Friday night. I will begin with Thursday at ED White for the boys. This is a huge one. So, again, despite my relative lack of knowledge of the soccer team, I will do my best. This is their first meeting this year, and overall in the last 5 or 6 years since 2012, 7 years actually, since 2012, we are 6-7-2. And this season, we have a chance to knot up that recent record book. However, many people will look at this game instead of Vandebilt trying to even up the score, of course, looking at ED White trying to even up the score. Because despite what history may tell you, Vandebilt has the last laugh right now. We met in the championship game, the state championship game last year, and we won that game in penalty kicks. That, in a rivalry game, in a state championship game, there's no better story than that. And there's no better story than the opponents trying to avenge it. And that's what this is all about, trying to avenge that loss from last year. And this game's going to be great. Both of these teams are very good. ED White is slightly favored in some statistics. They average 0.6 goals per game higher than us. However, to be fair, that's just at the time of the recording. They have 2 more games. So we have 1 more game before the clash on Thursday. And they also have a 9-5-1 record compared to our 3-4-2 record, again, as of the time of the recording. However, we have fared better against common opponents. Our 2 common opponents, Central Catholic and Jesuit, we have the same ACO against common opponent record. However, we have better goal differential against both opponents. We beat St. Charles Catholic, 8-0 as opposed to 7-0, which is relatively minuscule. However, the game against Jesuit is much more important to look at. We only lost to Jesuit 1-0 compared to ED White's relatively embarrassing loss 4-0 to Jesuit. I think that's very important to keep in consideration. I think this game is, of course, very winnable for us. This is the boys' soccer team. We have a very good chance of winning, but this game is going to be great. This game is going to be extremely important, and I think it'll be one to remember. And I feel like that mantra of a game to remember can be replicated in the girls' version of that game. Just like the boys, this is a matchup of 2 giants of the sport in Louisiana. Our girls are a top 25 team in the entire nation, ranked number 24 out of the thousands and thousands of teams nationally in high school. That's really, really impressive. Number 4 in the state, number 24 in the nation. Wow. ED White, despite also being, very well renowned as a soccer team, has a relatively average record this season so far of 5-4-1 compared to our 9-3-2 record. Now, this game also has a lot of story. It's not just a rivalry. It's not just 2 giants. It's a series. Last year and the year before, 2 years in a row, ED White and Vandebilt met in the state playoffs in the semifinals. And both years, Vandebilt won the game. 2 years ago to go on to win the state championship, and the year before and the year after that to go on to lose to U-High in the finals. Vandebilt has had great success off of beating ED White these past 2 years and in recent history as well. And of course, ED White will be looking to change that. District supremacy, bragging rights, and much, much more are at stake in this game Friday night. I hope you enjoyed this first episode of Terrier Talk. I hope to see you next week as well. Same time, same channel.